Right now, before you do anything else, walk to the nearest window. If you can step outside onto a porch or a balcony, even better. Just stand there for a second with your eyes open, facing roughly toward the sky. Don't stare at the sun. Just take in the light. You just did something that a tiny cluster of cells behind your eyes has been waiting for since the moment you woke up. Not the rods and cones you learned about in school. A completely different kind of cell, discovered only in 2002, that doesn't help you see shapes at all. Its only job is to tell your brain what time it is. This is not a video about vitamin D. It's not about mood, or getting outside more, or another vague wellness idea dressed up as science. This is about one very specific circuit in your body, and by the end of this, you'll be able to explain to your spouse, your kids, or your doctor exactly why the light hitting your eyes in the first 20 minutes after you wake up is doing something that no supplement, no exercise, and no amount of sleep can substitute for. And I'll tell you honestly, right up front, which parts of this are rock solid and which parts are still being worked out, because the title on this video mentions living decades longer, and I want to deal with that directly before we go any further, so it doesn't hang over everything I tell you. Here's the honest version of that claim. No single morning habit adds 30 years to your life. Nothing does. What the research actually shows is narrower and, honestly, more interesting. People whose internal body clock stays strong and well-timed into their 60s, 70s, and 80s tend to have meaningfully lower rates of the diseases that cut life short, and they tend to have more good years, not just more years. So think of this less as a life extension trick and more as a maintenance routine for a clock you didn't know you were carrying around. That reframing matters, and I'm not going to let you forget it. Let's start with what you can actually feel. If you've ever gone camping or stayed somewhere without curtains, you may have noticed something odd. You wake up naturally, sometimes even before an alarm, right around when the sky starts to lighten. That's not a coincidence, and it's not really about being outdoors. It's about your eyes receiving a signal at a very specific moment, and your body responding to that signal within seconds. The feeling of becoming genuinely alert. Not caffeine alert, but a kind of clean, physical wakefulness. A few minutes after you're outside in the morning is one of the few effects in this whole video you can verify on yourself this week without any equipment. So what's actually happening in the tissue? In the back of your eye, in the retina, most of what you've heard about are rods and cones, the cells responsible for image, color, detail. But scattered thinly among them is a separate population of cells called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. A researcher named David Burson at Brown University identified them properly in 2002, and it was genuinely a surprise to the field. A whole class of light-detecting cells hiding in plain sight that nobody had characterized. These cells contain a pigment called melanopsin, and melanopsin does not care about color or edges or faces. It cares about one thing: how much blue-enriched light is hitting it right now, especially in the blue wavelengths that dominate a clear morning sky. Here's the part most people get wrong. They assume any light works the same. It doesn't. Melanopsin is tuned to short wavelength blue light, the kind that's abundant outdoors even on an overcast day, and comparatively weak in most indoor bulbs and lamps. That's why standing near a bright window helps, but it helps less than actually being outside. Window glass filters out some of the very wavelengths these cells are hungriest for. Now follow the wire. Those melanopsin-containing cells don't send their signal to the visual cortex, where you'd process an image. They send it down a separate pathway called the retinohypothalamic tract, straight to a structure about the size of a grain of rice sitting just above where your optic nerves cross, called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Harvard sleep researcher Charles Zeisler spent much of his career mapping exactly how tightly this structure is controlled by light, and one of the clearest findings out of decades of that work is that light exposure timing can shift the suprachiasmatic nucleus's internal timing more precisely and more powerfully than almost anything else we know of. More than food timing, more than exercise timing, more than melatonin supplements. This nucleus is often called the master clock, and that's not an exaggeration. It doesn't run on its own guess about the time. It runs on a rough internal rhythm that drifts, left completely alone, to something a little longer than 24 hours. And morning light is the signal that yanks it back into alignment with the actual day, every single day. So here's the chain so far. Light hits melanopsin cells. Melanopsin cells fire down a dedicated nerve pathway. That pathway lands directly on your master clock. The master clock recalibrates. Now, what does the master clock actually do with that recalibration? This is where it gets interesting, because the suprachiasmatic nucleus doesn't just sit there ticking. It sends outgoing signals to another structure nearby, and one of the first things it does each morning, once it registers that daylight has arrived, is trigger a rise in cortisol. I want to pause on that word, because cortisol has a bad reputation it doesn't fully deserve. People hear cortisol and think stress hormone, something to suppress. But there's a very specific, healthy morning cortisol spike that has nothing to do with stress. Researchers call it the cortisol awakening response, and it was characterized in detail by psychobiologist Clemens Kirschbaum and colleagues starting in the 1990s. In a healthy pattern, cortisol rises sharply in the 30 to 45 minutes after waking, then falls steadily across the day. That morning rise is what mobilizes glucose for your muscles and brain, sharpens attention, and helps get blood pressure and heart rate up out of their nighttime lows, so your body is actually ready to be upright and functioning. Morning light exposure appears to sharpen and properly time this cortisol awakening response. Get bright light early, and the spike tends to happen on schedule and then taper the way it should. Miss it. Stay in dim indoor light all morning. And in some studies, the awakening response is blunted or delayed, and cortisol can stay elevated later into the day than it should, which is the opposite of what you want, because a cortisol curve that fails to come down properly in the evening is associated with poorer sleep that same night. Which brings us to the second half of this circuit, the one most people have actually heard of, melatonin. Here's the mechanism nobody explains properly. Melatonin isn't triggered by darkness at night out of nowhere. It's suppressed by light in the morning first, and that suppression sets a timer. Roughly 14 to 16 hours after your eyes register that strong morning light signal, your pineal gland begins releasing melatonin again. So the light you get at 7 a.m. isn't just waking you up. It's quietly setting the exact clock for when you'll start feeling sleepy that night. This is the part that matters enormously for people over 55, because one of the most consistent, well-documented changes with aging is that the amplitude of your natural melatonin rhythm shrinks. You still make some, but the nighttime rise is smaller and often later than it was at 30. Morning light is one of the few tools that reliably makes that shrinking signal easier for the system to detect and act on, because it sharpens the contrast between day and night that your master clock is trying to read. Let's go one layer further, because this is where it stops being about sleep and starts being about the rest of the body. The suprachiasmatic nucleus doesn't just talk to your pineal gland and your adrenal glands. It sends timing signals outward to what researchers call peripheral clocks. Nearly every organ, including your liver, your pancreas, your heart, and your fat tissue, runs its own local clock, and those local clocks look to the master clock in your brain for their cue on when morning has arrived. Sachin Panda, at the Salk Institute, has spent years mapping this, and one of the clearest findings from his lab and others is that when the master clock and the peripheral clocks fall out of sync with each other, a state sometimes called circadian misalignment, insulin sensitivity drops. Put plainly, the same meal, eaten by the same person, produces a larger blood sugar spike when their internal clocks are misaligned than when they're synchronized. This is not a small, theoretical detail for people in their 60s and beyond. Insulin resistance is one of the quiet threads running through cardiovascular disease, through metabolic syndrome, through the kind of slow weight gain around the middle that so many people assume is simply getting older. Some of it genuinely is aging. But some of the research out of the circadian field suggests that a portion of what looks like inevitable metabolic decline is actually clock drift. A body that's still perfectly capable of handling glucose well, but is getting confused signals about what time it is. Here's a reversal worth sitting with for a second. We tend to think of aging as the body simply wearing out, like a machine losing parts. But a chunk of what shows up as age-related decline is closer to a scheduling problem. organs that are still functional but no longer receiving a clean, well-timed signal about when to switch into active mode and when to switch into repair and rest mode. And the eyes, quietly, are the entry point for the signal that keeps that schedule honest. Now, one more system worth naming, because it ties everything together: blood pressure. Healthy cardiovascular rhythm includes something called nocturnal dipping, blood pressure that drops by roughly 10 to 20% overnight compared to daytime levels. This dip is protective. The heart and vessels get a genuine rest period. Circadian researchers, including work summarized by Zeisler's group and others studying shift workers, have found that people with disrupted light-dark exposure patterns are more likely to show what's called a non-dipping pattern: blood pressure that stays elevated through the night. Non-dipping is associated, in a large amount of observational cardiology research, with higher long-term cardiovascular risk. The causal arrow here: whether fixing your light exposure actually restores healthy dipping, and whether that in turn changes outcomes, is less settled than the cortisol and melatonin research. I want to be honest about that rather than blur it into false certainty. Let me give you that honesty pass properly now, because you've earned a clear map of what's solid ground and what's still being built. Strongly established, backed by decades of controlled laboratory work. Melanopsin-containing retinal cells exist. They respond specifically to short-wavelength light, they project directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and morning light exposure shifts the timing of that nucleus more powerfully than almost any other input. Also strongly established, morning bright light reliably suppresses melatonin and helps entrain its evening rise to a predictable schedule. Established but more modest in size. The cortisol awakening response is sharpened by morning light exposure in many studies, though the effect size varies across individuals, and some people show robust responses while others show much smaller ones. The mechanism is real, but sharpened doesn't mean dramatically transformed. Physically plausible, supported by observational and mechanistic research, but not proven through the kind of long-term randomized trial that would settle it. That consistent morning light exposure, by keeping the master clock and peripheral organ clocks in better alignment over years, meaningfully reduces the incidence of the metabolic and cardiovascular problems associated with circadian misalignment, and that this contributes to the population-level associations between stronger daily rhythms and lower mortality risk seen in large cohort studies, including analyses of activity and light exposure data from biobank-scale populations. That last part is association, not proof of cause. People whose rhythms stay strong into old age may simply be healthier to begin with, in ways that also protect their rhythms. Good research tries to account for that, but it can't fully erase the question. So to be blunt about the effect size question, because I promised I wouldn't inflate this, getting outside in the morning is not going to hand you 30 extra years. What the honest version of the evidence supports is that it's a low-cost, biologically well-understood way of keeping a genuinely important internal system. One that touches sleep, blood sugar, and blood pressure all at once, running the way it's supposed to run. That's a real thing. It's just a quieter, more mechanistic kind of real than a headline number. Before I get to what to actually do, quickly, if this kind of explanation is useful to you, a comment answering one specific question helps me know what to cover next. What time do you currently first get outside after waking? Roughly? Not perfect, not ideal. Just honestly, what time? Now, back to the science, because there's one more layer worth understanding before we get practical. That layer is intensity, because this is where almost everyone underestimates what they're working with. Indoor lighting, even a well-lit room, typically measures somewhere in the range of 200 to 500 lux. Overcast daylight outdoors, the kind you'd barely call sunny, is commonly measured at 10,000 lux or more. Full sun can exceed 100,000 lux. This isn't a small gap. It's a difference of 1 or 2 full orders of magnitude, and melanopsin cells respond to that scale of intensity difference in a way that ordinary indoor brightness simply can't replicate, no matter how many lamps you turn on. This is precisely why I open my curtains doesn't produce the same effect as I stood outside. It's not about the light being visible to you. It's about the raw quantity of blue-enriched photons reaching a cell that only cares about quantity. So, practically, what do you actually do with all of this? First, Within roughly 30 to 60 minutes of waking, get outside, without sunglasses, for somewhere around 10 to 20 minutes. You do not need to look at the sun. In fact, don't. Face generally toward the sky, keep your eyes open in a normal, relaxed way, and let ambient light reach them. This connects directly to the mechanism we just covered. It's giving melanopsin cells the intensity of signal they need to properly set your suprachiasmatic nucleus for the day, which cascades into your cortisol timing and your melatonin timing that night. On a cloudy day, this still works. Overcast daylight is still vastly brighter than any indoor space. So don't skip it because the sun isn't visible. Second, and this connects to the same clock through a different door, try to keep your first meal reasonably consistent in timing, ideally within the same 1 to 2 hour window most days. Remember, the peripheral clock in your pancreas and liver is listening for consistency, not just brightness. A wildly variable eating schedule sends its own confusing set of timing signals that can work against what you just did with your eyes. This won't produce dramatic weight loss on its own. I want to be honest that this is a modest, supporting piece, not the star of the show, but it reinforces the same synchronization the light exposure is building. Third, protect the other end of the cycle. In the 2 to 3 hours before bed, dim your indoor lighting where practical, and if you're on a screen, understand that its effect is real but smaller than people often assume. Screen light matters less than direct morning sunlight matters, so don't let anxiety about your phone distract you from the much bigger lever, which is what you did or didn't do with your eyes 8 or 10 hours earlier, that morning. And fourth, if getting outside genuinely isn't possible some days, bad weather, mobility limits, whatever the reason, sitting directly by the largest window you have, as close to it as comfortably possible for 20 to 30 minutes, is a real, if smaller, substitute. It is not equivalent to being outside. Be honest with yourself about that gap and use the real outdoor version whenever you can. What this will not do, it will not replace medication for blood pressure or diabetes, it will not undo decades of a disrupted sleep schedule in a week, and it will not work as a substitute for actual daylight if you simply stand near a lamp and call it done. It is a foundation, not a cure, and it works best stacked underneath the basics you likely already know: reasonable sleep duration, movement, and decent nutrition, rather than instead of them. So go back to that window you stood at when this started. You're standing in the same spot. Nothing around you looks different. But you now know that a specific, thin population of cells in your retina, a type of cell science didn't even properly describe until this century, just fired a signal down a dedicated nerve pathway to a cluster smaller than a grape, sitting above your optic nerves, and that cluster just began quietly resetting the timing of your cortisol, your melatonin, your blood sugar handling, and the rhythm of your own heartbeat overnight, all from the light currently touching your open eyes. You didn't feel any of that happening. That's the strange part. The most important recalibration your body does every single day is completely silent, and the only sign you get is a plain, ordinary window and a decision, most mornings, to actually stand in front of it.